The 14-gauge needle went in like muscle memory, and nobody saw it coming. They called her the quiet one. Just another night shift nurse pushing through Cedar Creek Medical's ER with her head down, checking vitals, charting notes, never speaking unless spoken to. They didn't know that the surgical precision in how she moved through those corridors, the way her hands never trembled during codes, the way she could assess a trauma patient in 3 seconds flat, came from 12 years in uniform, 2 deployments to Ramadi, and a Bronze Star they'd erased from every record. They didn't know that the slight limp favoring her left leg was shrapnel, not age. Dead wrong on both counts. The night shift started at 2,300 hours, and Ashley Cooper arrived the way she always did, early, quiet, moving through the sliding glass doors of Cedar Creek Medical like she was checking a perimeter. San Antonio humidity hit her face, warm and thick as blood, carrying that particular smell of a hospital parking lot at night, diesel exhaust mixing with antiseptic seeping out from under the doors. She clipped her name tag to her faded blue scrubs, Cooper, A.R.N., without looking at it. The name meant nothing here. That was the point. Inside, the ER hummed with the rhythm of controlled chaos. Monitor beeps sang their steady mechanical song. A stretcher squeaked past on rubber wheels. The intercom crackled with codes from upstairs. Ashley moved through it all like water, her movements efficient, economical, the kind of movement that came from training so deep it lived in her bones. Her scrubs were worn soft at the elbows. Her shoes, New Balance, practical, white but grayed with time, made almost no sound on the tile floor. The charge nurse, Diana, handed her the night assignment without looking up. You've got beds 3, 7, 9, and the new SEAL in 12. His post-Ramadi, still pretty disoriented on the morphine. Dr. Mercer's on call but he's upstairs with a board meeting. Should be down for round sometime before dawn. Ashley nodded, took the tablet, and scanned it. Room 12 made her hands pause for half a second, just half a second, no longer. A SEAL. Ramadi. The words were stitched into her spine, and she felt them land like shrapnel. She straightened, breathed, kept moving. The supply closet was her first stop. She'd been coming here for 6 weeks now, moving through the same routine every shift, check inventory sheets, compare them to invoices, write down the numbers that didn't add up. The discrepancies had started small. Then they'd started screaming. Supply costs had tripled in 3 months. Patient outcomes had flatlined. New line bundle infections up 40%. Ventilator-associated pneumonia up 60%. The math was simple once you looked at it, and Ashley had spent 23 years looking at broken systems and finding the fracture lines. The supply closet was narrow, lined with shelves of saline bags and 4 kits and sterile gloves stacked in precise white towers. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects. Ashley pulled out her small leather notebook, the one she kept in her locker, the one no one had ever asked about, and made notations against the invoice for medical supplies dated 3 days ago. The order sheet said 218-gauge peripheral for catheters. The actual count on shelf was 93. The discrepancy went back 2 months. The costs went back further. She touched the folded flag in her locker before closing it. She always did. The flag was small, the kind you get at a military funeral, the kind that carries the weight of a person folded into a triangle. She didn't open it anymore. She didn't need to. She knew every crease. She knew whose hands had touched it before hers. 31 years old, from North Carolina, called Hammer because he never quit. Dead for 8 years. Still alive in the weight of that cloth. Ashley shook her head once, sharp. Compartmentalize. Focus. She closed the locker and moved back into the ER. Room 12 was at the far end of the critical care unit, separated from the chaos by glass walls and one thick door that hissed open when she approached. The patient was awake, which meant the morphine was still effective enough to keep him comfortable but not enough to knock him completely under. His chart said Lieutenant Marcus Richardson, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Admitted 0600 hours. 3 weeks post-deployment. Still healing. He was watching the door when she came in. Ashley moved to the vital signs monitor, her movement smooth and practiced, gathering the blood pressure cuff without meeting his eyes. The routine was muscle memory, BP, heart rate, respiratory rate, O2 sat, temperature. Check the foresight. Assess the bandages. Document. Move. But Richardson was staring at her name tag. She felt it before she looked up, that particular weight of recognition that comes right before catastrophe. His eyes were dark, intelligent, the kind that had seen bad things and learned to think fast in response. His left forearm lay on top of the blanket, and the fresh tattoo there was still red with healing, Cooper, in letters 2 inches tall, surrounded by the crossed rifles of an infantryman. His brow furrowed. He looked from her name tag to the tattoo. Back to her name tag. His jaw moved like he wanted to speak, but the morphine was thick in his veins, and his words came out tangled. "Your name?" "I'm just checking your vitals," Ashley said quietly. Her voice was soft, deferential, careful. The mask was perfect. She wrapped the BP cuff around his arm without meeting his eyes. "Squeeze for me." He squeezed, but he was still staring. Still thinking through the medication haze, trying to connect something his brain knew was important but couldn't quite reach through the pain and the drugs and the exhaustion of survival. "I know someone," he started, and then a cough caught him, and she had to adjust the oxygen cannula, and the moment passed. By the time the coughing stopped, she'd already finished the vitals, already documented them, already moved toward the door. "You're stable," she said, the word landing with the weight of a routine check. "Nothing more. Call if you need anything." She was out before he could ask the question that was forming in his eyes. The rest of the night moved in its own rhythm. Bed 3 was a pneumonia case, sitting up and coughing into a tissue, needing his oxygen adjusted and his for fluids running. Bed 7 was a migraine that wasn't going away, and Ashley brought the dark and quiet and checked on him every hour, never speaking more than necessary. Bed 9 was a diabetic complication, blood sugar 487, needing insulin and monitoring and the kind of patient education that came from knowing how the body broke and how to coax it back together. By 0400 hours, the ER had reached that particular quiet that comes right before dawn, when the night shift people are tired and the day shift people haven't arrived yet, and the hospital exists in a thin space between two worlds. The fluorescent light seemed louder in that quiet. The monitor beep seemed sharper. Ashley was at the med station, verifying medications, when an attending named Dr. Simmons passed by the vending machine. He didn't speak to her, nobody ever did, but his voice carried in that particular way voices do when they're not trying to be heard, which means they're trying very hard to be heard. "You know," he said to the vending machine, to the four-pole he was adjusting, to nobody and everybody, "I've seen a lot of nurses work these shifts. Most of them, you know, they've actually got credentials worth the paper they're printed on." The vending machine hummed. It didn't respond. Ashley didn't respond either. She kept verifying medications. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply continued working, the way a person does when they've been insulted by someone so beneath notice that acknowledging them would actually be a waste of energy. Simmons waited, maybe hoping for a reaction. When none came, he wandered off toward the coffee station, and the night moved on. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in room 12, a Navy SEAL was lying awake in the dark, staring at his own forearm, trying to remember a name he'd heard through morphine and explosions and the long flight home, trying to place the woman with copper-colored hair and careful eyes who'd checked his vitals with the kind of competence that came from somewhere much deeper than a nursing degree. He was staring at the tattoo, at the name that meant something, something important, something his brain knew but his mouth couldn't quite form through the medication and the exhaustion. He didn't know that the woman who'd checked his vitals had once carried him through enemy fire while their entire position was being systematically dismantled by insurgent mortar fire. He didn't know that she'd been the team's combat medic before she was a nurse, before she was anything other than Captain Ashley Cooper, call sign Valkyrie, the one who never quit, the one who'd kept him alive when stopping would have been merciful. He didn't know any of that. And Ashley, moving through the rest of her shift with that quiet competence that made her invisible, was going to make sure he never found out. The sun was starting to lighten the sky outside the eastern windows when Dr. Mercer arrived for morning rounds. The sun was starting to lighten the sky outside the eastern windows when Dr. Mercer arrived for morning rounds. He moved through Cedar Creek Medical like a man who owned the place, shoulders back, chin elevated, the kind of posture that announces authority before words ever do. Ashley was restocking the medication cart on the third floor when she heard his voice echoing down the corridor, summoning the residents and attending physicians to Conference Room B for grand rounds. She knew what that meant. She'd heard the whispers. Mercer was planning something. By 8:06 a.m., 32 medical professionals crowded into the conference room, residents crammed into plastic chairs, attendings standing along the back wall, a few senior nurses lingering near the door. The air smelled of stale coffee and the faint antiseptic tang that never quite washed out of the walls at Cedar Creek. Ashley stood in the far corner, her posture neutral, her face a carefully constructed mask. She'd learned long ago how to be invisible in a room full of people. How to absorb impact without flinching. Mercer stood at the front, his hand hovering over a laser pointer like a conductor preparing to raise his baton. On the screen behind him, a patient chart materialized, room 12. The SEAL patient. Ashley's chart. Mercer's smile was the smile of a man about to perform. "Let's discuss Nurse Cooper's work as a learning opportunity," he announced, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone executing a well-rehearsed routine. The residents shifted in their seats. Mercer circled something on the projected screen with his laser pointer. A red dot dancing across digital entries like a predator circling prey. Note the incomplete assessment here. The medication timing discrepancy there. He paused, letting the silence settle like dust. This is what happens when standards slip. Ashley's jaw tightened. Just slightly. A hairline fracture in her composure that only someone trained to read micro-expressions would notice. She'd seen the patient chart last night during her shift. Every entry had been pristine. Perfect. Which meant every error Mercer was now dissecting had been planted there between midnight and 6 in the morning. He'd accessed her digital records. He'd created false documentation. He'd manufactured ammunition. For 8 minutes, Mercer continued. 8 minutes of his voice dissecting her work, each critique landing with surgical precision. The residents took notes. The attendings nodded solemnly. One of the junior physicians glanced toward Ashley with something between sympathy and schadenfreude, the expression of someone grateful it wasn't their chart on the screen. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, a mechanical drone that seemed to amplify Mercer's words, making them bounce off every surface in the room. Ashley stood motionless. Arms crossed. Eyes empty. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Her hands were steady. Her breathing shallow and controlled. She'd stood in darkness deeper than this. She'd held the lives of her brothers in her hands while rounds of ammunition punched through adobe walls. This was a man with a laser pointer and wounded ego. This was nothing. When Mercer finally paused, his breath catching as he reached for another slide, the silence lasted exactly 3 beats. Ashley let those 3 beats stretch like taffy, making him wait, making every pair of eyes in the room swing toward her. Then she spoke. "Funny how my substandard work has a lower readmission rate than yours." Her voice cut through the room like a scalpel through silk. Quiet. Precise. Lethal in its simplicity. She didn't raise it. Didn't inflect it for drama. She simply stated fact. The kind of fact that made Mercer's jawline lock, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish gasping for oxygen that wasn't there. Ashley turned on her heel and walked out. Didn't wait for his response. Didn't acknowledge the sharp intake of breath from 3 residents in the front row. Just walked. The rubber sole of her shoe squeaked against the tile floor as she left, a small, almost musical sound that seemed to punctuate her exit more effectively than any door slam could have managed. Behind her, Mercer's face flushed the color of overripe strawberries. His hand, still gripping the laser pointer, trembled. One of the senior attendings suddenly became very interested in his shoes. The residents exchanged glances, the kind of looks passed between people who just witnessed the unthinkable. Someone had talked back to Dr. Mercer in front of the entire department. And she'd been right. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd done it without anger. Without desperation. Without even the mercy of emotion. She'd simply stated the truth and walked away, leaving him flushed and furious and completely, utterly diminished. Ashley didn't return to the medication cart. Instead, she moved through the hospital with the kind of calculated invisibility that came from years of training. She checked on patients in the orthopedic wing. She responded to call bells. She moved through the institutional rhythms of Cedar Creek as though her chest wasn't tight with anticipation, as though she hadn't just lit a fuse that would burn much faster than she'd intended. By 11:15 a.m., standing in front of the vending machine on the second floor, an attending physician she'd never spoken to leaned against the wall beside her while she retrieved her coffee. He wasn't alone. A younger resident stood next to him, both of them close enough that Ashley could smell the stale residue of someone else's cologne mixed with latex gloves and hand sanitizer. "Even the vending machine won't take her credentials," the attending said to the resident, loud enough for Ashley to hear. The words were meant to cut, meant to land in the soft places. The resident laughed. A nervous, forced sound that echoed down the empty corridor. Ashley didn't break stride. She collected her coffee. Inserted her dollar bill into the next machine, the snack dispenser. Selected a protein bar with the same mechanical precision she'd used to sight a rifle. The entire interaction lasted 6 seconds. She didn't acknowledge the attending. Didn't acknowledge the resident. Didn't even look in their direction. She simply existed in their space, extracted what she needed, and left. Invisibility was a weapon. Most people never understood that. They thought power came from volume, from presence, from making yourself impossible to ignore. But Ashley had learned in Ramadi that power came from being able to remain calm while everything around you fractured. From being able to extract yourself from hostile territory when 3 Marines depended on your steady hands and steadier judgment. From being able to absorb an insult and keep breathing like your lungs hadn't just been hollowed out. The attending's laughter faded as she walked away. That afternoon, Mercer caught her in the medication room. The small space between the shelves suddenly felt cramped, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something like the ozone residue after a defibrillator fires, sharp and electric and dangerous. He appeared in the doorway the way predators appeared in places you hadn't known they were watching. "Security will escort you out if you don't improve, charity case," he said. His voice was smooth now, the flush gone, replaced with something far more calculated. "I've seen plenty of nurses like you. Thinking you're special. Thinking you matter." He smiled. The smile of a man holding cards he didn't realize were marked. "You're not. You're nothing." Ashley looked at him. Those same flat, dead eyes. Eyes that had seen things that would hollow out a lesser person. Eyes that recognized the shape of a man pretending to hold power over someone who'd already sacrificed everything that could be taken from her. "Need anything else?" she asked. Her voice soft. Deferential. The mask back in place perfectly. He stepped closer. "Just want to make sure we understand each other." "Crystal clear, Doctor." She stepped around him. Their shoulders didn't quite touch, but the air between them seemed to vibrate with something he couldn't name. Something that made the hair on his arms stand up even though the medication room was climate-controlled to exactly 72 degrees. By 2 p.m., Mercer was making phone calls from his office. The administrator heard the fragments through the closed door. "Board members need to know about a potential credentialing issue. Can't verify her background completely. Patient safety is my only concern." His voice was smoke and mirrors, carefully constructed, a performance of righteousness that had worked for him for 6 years. He called board members. Called the State Nursing Regulatory Board. Called the VA demanding service records for a Captain Ashley Cooper who technically did not exist in any database that had never been officially opened to him. In room 12, the SEAL patient's vitals began to shift. His oxygen saturation dipped to 94%. His respiratory rate climbed from 18 to 22 breaths per minute. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would show up as an emergency on the monitors. Just small changes. The kind of subtle deterioration that could cascade into something catastrophic if no one was paying close enough attention. If the person watching him wasn't trained to read the language of bodies about to fail. Ashley noticed it during her afternoon rounds. She was pulling up his chart when Mercer found her in the hallway. "Mr. Richardson is being transferred to Dr. Patel's care," he announced. Not asked. Announced. "You're reassigned to the orthopedic wing effective immediately." Ashley looked at him. He's showing early signs of respiratory compromise. Dr. Patel is fully capable. You're dismissed from this case. She stared at him for one long moment. Long enough that Mercer felt the weight of that stare like a physical thing. Long enough that he almost stepped backward. Almost. But he didn't. He held his ground, his hand resting on the patient chart like it was a trophy he'd just won. "Understood," Ashley said finally. She turned and walked away, leaving Mercer standing in the hallway with his small victory and no idea that he'd just cut the last thread connecting him to a reckoning he couldn't yet imagine. The evening shift began at 3 p.m. By 6, the first investigator from the State Nursing Board would arrive at Cedar Creek Medical asking to review Ashley Cooper's personnel file and service records. By 9, someone from the Pentagon would be making phone calls that would eventually lead to a General 2-star commanding the nearest base to ask pointed questions about why his facility was being contacted regarding a nurse whose military records had been sealed under national security protocols that suggested she wasn't just a nurse at all. But none of that was happening yet. For now, there was just a quiet woman in scrubs making her way to a new assignment. There was just a man in an office believing his strategy was working. There was just the ordinary machinery of a hospital moving forward, unaware that something beneath the surface had been set in motion. Something patient. Something certain. Something that, once begun, could not be stopped. The sun outside the windows continued its slow descent toward evening. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal mechanical song. And somewhere in room 12, a Navy SEAL kept his eyes on the doorway, waiting for the person who hadn't quite let him die to come back. The supply closet at 2 a.m. smelled like industrial bleach and something else, the sharp metallic tang of money hidden in plain sight. Ashley stood in the darkness, her phone's flashlight beam cutting across shelves of surgical kits that should have been accounted for. The invoice stapled to the cardboard box read 52 units. The shelf held 17. She photographed the discrepancy without trembling, without haste. 31 kits billed but never delivered. 31 times the hospital's margin. Her jaw clenched once, then released. She'd learned long ago that anger was a luxury she couldn't afford. The medications came next. Morphine, fentanyl, propofol, controlled substances tracked to the milligram by federal regulation. The invoices from Apex Medical Supply showed bulk orders arriving twice weekly for the past 18 months. Ashley pulled up the actual pharmacy intake logs on her phone. The numbers didn't match. Not even close. A gap of approximately 40% between what Mercer's office claimed to purchase and what the dispensary actually received. She knew what that gap meant. She'd seen it before in Ramadi, that the thieves there wore different uniforms and the consequences were measured in blood rather than hospital budgets. She worked through for more nights, moving like a ghost between patient rooms and supply inventories. Nobody noticed. Nobody was looking at a night shift nurse with a name tag instead of a record. On Tuesday she found the pattern that made everything crystallize. Apex Medical Supply's owner was listed on Cedar Creek's board of directors, a man named Sterling with a portfolio that included 3 other hospitals in the greater San Antonio area. All 3 had seen supply costs triple under new administrations in the past 2 years. All 3 had experienced stagnant or declining patient outcomes. She pulled up the public records on her laptop during her lunch break in the break room, the fluorescent lights casting everything in the color of hospital gilt. $23 million in orders across for facilities. Roughly $9 million unaccounted for. The math was simple. The mechanism was elegant. Someone was billing for supplies that never arrived and pocketing the difference. The hospitals absorbed the cost through inflated procurement contracts. Patient care suffered because the money allocated for equipment and medication was bleeding out through the supply chain. It was a slow drain, designed to go unnoticed by busy administrators and overworked nurses. It was the kind of crime that killed people in increments so small that nobody could trace a single death back to the fraud. Ashley had held dying patients before. She recognized the architecture of negligence when she saw it. What she didn't understand at first was why Mercer had chosen to publicly crucify her during grand rounds. Why risk drawing attention to himself by attacking a nurse who was just doing her job? Then she understood. He'd seen something in her eyes when she was comparing those invoices, the kind of focus that doesn't come from curiosity. The kind of focus that comes from training. The kind of focus that recognizes predation for what it is. He'd needed to scare her. To shame her into silence. To establish a narrative that would discredit anything she might say later. A nurse with substandard charting would make a poor witness. A nurse publicly humiliated in front of the medical staff would be easy to dismiss as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. But she hadn't trembled. She hadn't cried. She hadn't retreated or apologized. And now she was the kind of loose thread that unraveling his entire operation depended on removing. The call came on Wednesday at 8:44 p.m. Ashley was charting in the nurse's station when the intercom crackled, "Dr. Mercer to administration." "Dr. Mercer to administration, code urgent." She'd heard that tone before. It was the tone of institutional machinery shifting. The sound of a man whose days were numbered trying to buy time. She didn't look up from her documentation, but she noted the time. She noted the urgency in the page operator's voice. Someone had made a call. Someone had asked a question that couldn't be answered without triggering further scrutiny. By Thursday morning, the hospital's administrative level was thrumming with quiet panic. An external investigator from a firm called Garrison and Associates had arrived with a briefcase and a federal mandate. The board had been forced to grant them access to all procurement records dating back 3 years. The compliance officer, a woman named Helena with the posture of someone who'd been waiting for this moment, had pulled the invoices and started cross-referencing them against delivery logs and pharmacy intake. The discrepancies were obvious once someone actually looked. Glaringly, humiliatingly obvious. Ashley watched from the orthopedic wing as board members began arriving for emergency meetings in the executive conference room. 2 of them she recognized as regular attendees at the hospital's quarterly reviews. One looked grey. Another kept checking his watch as if time could somehow run backward if he concentrated hard enough. By 2 p.m. there were men in suits with badges in the hallway. Not police. Federal. The kind of badges that meant this had stopped being a hospital problem and started being a criminal investigation. Mercer didn't come to the hospital on Thursday. His office door remained locked, his light off. His assistant fielded calls with increasingly hollow assurances that the doctor was in a meeting. By Friday the whispers had become conversations. By Saturday the truth had crystallized enough that people could speak it aloud without fear of retaliation. Dr. Marcus Mercer, chief of emergency medicine at Cedar Creek for the past 7 years, had orchestrated a billing fraud scheme that had diverted approximately $900,000 to a supply company in which he held a silent partnership with the board director named Sterling. The scheme had been running across multiple hospitals. The methodology was sophisticated enough to suggest professional expertise. The timeline made it clear that Mercer had used his position not only to perpetrate the fraud but to ensure that anyone who noticed would be too intimidated to report it. Ashley stood in the break room on Friday evening, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she stared at nothing. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. The quiet composure that had kept her alive through 5 deployments to Ramadi was still intact, still functional, still holding her spine in perfect alignment. Somewhere in the building, Mercer's empire was collapsing under the weight of its own illegality. Somewhere in room 12, a Navy SEAL was still waiting for someone to explain why the quietest nurse on the ward had seemed so familiar. And somewhere in her locker, a folded flag from a teammate who died covering her extraction from the city of Ramadi remained exactly where it had been since the moment she'd hung up her uniform. She'd brought down a corrupt system without firing a shot. Not through violence or revelation. Through the meticulous, patient accumulation of evidence. Through the quiet work of someone who'd learned how to dismantle criminal enterprises from people who specialized in that kind of precision. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Mercer had been right about one thing. She wasn't just a nurse. And now, whether she wanted it or not, everybody was about to find out exactly what she was. The administrator's office smelled like stale coffee and furniture polish, the kind of room designed to make people feel small. Ashley sat across from the mahogany desk, her scrub still damp from the shift, her hands folded carefully in her lap. Dr. Mercer occupied the chair beside her, his posture relaxed, his expression the satisfied look of a man who had just won something he'd been hunting for weeks. The administrator wouldn't meet her eyes. "Ashley, we've received some troubling information about your background. Verification issues. Your credentials don't." He trailed off, shuffling papers like they might explain what he couldn't say. "And yesterday's incident, you directly countermanded an attending physician's order. You performed a medical procedure without authorization. We have to think about liability." "I'm sorry." "Effective immediately." The words blurred together: liability, terminated, security escort. She didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Her jaw clenched once, a tiny movement no one would have caught unless they'd been trained to notice muscle tension under stress. "You'll turn in your badge and access card today," the administrator continued, still not looking at her. "Security will walk you out. There's severance. 2 weeks' pay. Your health insurance extends 30 days. Mercer smiled. Thin. Calculated. The smile of a man who had orchestrated this moment perfectly, who had called in favors and made promises and destroyed someone he saw as a threat to his empire. His eyes glittered with the kind of satisfaction that comes from winning a war he'd started in grand rounds 2 weeks ago. Ashley stood. She reached into her pocket and withdrew her badge, the laminated ID card with her name and photo, the thing that had given her access, given her purpose, given her a name that wasn't erased. She placed it on the desk in front of the administrator with the precision of someone laying down a weapon. Her hand shook. Not with fear. With rage so cold and focused it felt like frostbite in her chest. Being erased the first time had been ordered by the military, sanctioned by protocol, justified by national security. This was different. This was personal. This was Mercer watching her save a man's life and deciding she was a problem that needed to be solved. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice flat and level, carrying the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. She walked toward the door without waiting for dismissal. "Captain Cooper," Mercer started, then caught himself. The slip was tiny, barely audible, but it hung in the air like smoke. Ashley paused at the threshold without turning around. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then she continued walking. That afternoon, the kitchen was too quiet. Ashley sat at the small table in their San Antonio home, still wearing her scrubs, the fabric clinging to her skin with sweat and antiseptic and the smell of a hospital that no longer wanted her. Her hands pressed against her face, her shoulders curved inward, her breath coming in the kind of measured inhales that came from counting down from 10 because the alternative was breaking something. Her son, Marcus, 14 years old with his father's dark eyes and her mother's stubbornness, appeared in the doorway with his backpack still on from school. He stopped, reading the room the way kids do when they've learned to recognize danger. "Mom? Why are you home early?" She couldn't answer. Couldn't explain that some enemies wear stethoscopes and hospital IDs and smile while they destroy you. Couldn't tell him that she'd spent 12 years in the military carrying people through fire, and now she'd been carried out of a hospital by security because a doctor had decided she was a liability. "It's okay," she managed, which was the worst possible answer. Marcus sat down beside her, uncertain, scared. "Did something happen? Are you hurt?" She shook her head. Just shook her head. Because how do you explain to your child that sometimes the battles can't be won? That sometimes the enemy has lawyers and board members and the institutional power to erase you twice? The next morning, at 4 a.m., Marcus went into the garage. He opened the storage cabinet where she kept the locked wooden box. His hands shook as he worked the combination she'd given him years ago for emergencies only, and he decided that this qualified. When the box opened, he understood why she'd never let him see inside. Medals lay nested in velvet. A navy cross catching the garage light like a star. A silver star. 2 purple hearts with their distinctive gilt edges. Campaign ribbons in neat rows, Afghanistan, Iraq, Horn of Africa. And at the bottom, folded with military precision, an American flag that someone had held while it draped a coffin. There was a photograph too. His mother, 15 years younger, in desert fatigues, and 416 Hong Kong dollars across her chest, a unit patch on her shoulder that read Task Force Dagger. Her call sign, Valkyrie, written in black marker on her body armor. She was looking directly at the camera with eyes that had seen things that would break most people into pieces. He took the box. The next morning, during Mercer's staff meeting, 12 attendings and residents gathered around the polished conference table discussing personnel standards and professional conduct. The door opened without anyone knocking. Ashley's son walked in carrying the wooden box. The room went silent the way rooms do when they recognize something significant is happening, the way air pressure changes before a storm. "Excuse me, son, this is a private meeting," the administrator started. Marcus didn't hesitate. His voice was clear and steady. "Mom, they need to see these." He appended the box onto Mercer's conference table. The medals scattered across the wood like accusation. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Purple hearts spilling like drops of blood. Campaign ribbons fanning across the polished surface. And the folded flag tumbling end over end before landing on top like a conclusion. The room erupted in whispers. In the hallway outside, being transported to imaging in a wheelchair, Navy SEAL Richardson heard the commotion. He saw the medals through the glass partition. He saw Ashley standing in the conference room, her face white, her body rigid with a kind of shock that comes from being exposed. His eyes went wide. He whispered one word that barely made it past his lips, "Valkyrie." An attending picked up the Navy Cross with trembling hands. "What is this?" A Marine Corps liaison, visiting a patient on the veteran wing, appeared in the doorway. He saw the medals and Ashley in the same glance, and his entire posture changed, spine straightening, shoulders back, the involuntary response of a warrior recognizing rank that had nothing to do with a nameplate. He reached for the citation attached to the Navy Cross with reverent fingers. His voice, when he began reading aloud, carried the weight of official record for extraordinary heroism under fire. In defense of Allied forces. Without regard for personal safety. Captain Ashley Cooper. SEAL Team 3. Task Force Dagger. Call sign, Valkyrie. Mercer lurched forward, his face flooded with red, his voice rising. "This is a termination hearing, not a circus. This is inappropriate. Security." But the doorway filled with a different kind of presence. A 2-star general, touring the hospital's veteran wing, stepped through with a kind of authority that made even Mercer's voice catch. The general surveyed the scattered medals, then looked at Ashley. He saw the Navy Cross. He saw the Silver Star. He saw the Purple Hearts. He saluted. Sharp. Crisp. The kind of salute that comes from deep muscle memory and deeper respect. Ashley stood instinctively, her entire body snapping to attention, the transformation so complete it was like watching a different person emerge from beneath the scrubs. "Captain Cooper," the general said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "It's an honor." Residents stared. Attendings went pale. The administrator looked like he might become ill. Within 30 minutes, a Pentagon representative arrived, a woman in a dark suit with credentials that cleared every security checkpoint in the hospital. She surveyed the room with the calm of someone who had seen this kind of institutional failure before. She spoke into her phone, confirmed. "It's Valkyrie." Then she addressed the room with the kind of precision that comes from classified briefings and official record. Captain Ashley Cooper's military records were sealed under national security protocols following a classified operation in Ramadi. Call sign, Valkyrie. She carried 6 wounded Navy SEALs through enemy fire for 11 hours over difficult terrain. Official designation, erased for operational security. She received orders never to surface under her true identity. Those orders are still in effect. Attempts to investigate her background without proper clearance constitute violations of federal statute. Richardson, wheeled into the doorway by an orderly, went pale. Tears started sliding down his face. You carried me. I heard your voice the whole time. You wouldn't let me die. I got your name tattooed because it was the only thing I remembered. Cooper. He showed his forearm, where the letters stood in block black ink. You're Valkyrie. You're her. You. Yes, Ashley said quietly. She was still at attention, her voice carrying an octave lower now, the voice of someone who'd given orders to soldiers and watched them execute with precision. I carried you out, petty officer. You're welcome. The Pentagon representative turned to Mercer with an expression of professional disgust. And you launched an investigation into her background? Demanded VA records. Mercer's face had gone the color of old paper. Her file is classified top secret SCI, the representative continued. Every inquiry you made has been logged. Every call is recorded. Congratulations, Doctor. You just violated the Espionage Act. The hospital conference room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that came from respect or attention. This was the silence of a man watching his world collapse in real time. Ashley's son had walked into that morning staff meeting carrying a wooden box the size of a cigar case, worn at the corners from careful handling. He was 14, his shoulders squared like someone twice his age, and when he set it on Mercer's conference table, the room's fluorescent light seemed to dim in anticipation. No one moved. He opened the box with both hands, ceremonial and deliberate, and let the contents fall where they belonged. The Navy Cross. The Silver Star. 2 purple hearts. Each medal caught the light as it landed on the polished mahogany, and beside them, a folded flag the size of a man's hand, creased into a tight triangle, the fabric the color of old blood. Mom, they need to see these, her son said, his voice steady in a way that made his age irrelevant. They need to know who you really are. The conference room erupted. Not in applause. In chaos. Phones emerged. Board members stood. The hospital administrator's face shifted from confusion to something approximating horror. Mercer didn't move at first, he just stared at the medals as if they were weapons pointed at his chest. Richardson, the Navy SEAL recovering in the East Wing, was in a wheelchair in the hallway when word spread. A nurse mentioned it in passing as she checked his drain output. His hand went white on the armrest. When the color returned to his face, it brought with it a clarity that had been missing for days, the fog of pain and medication lifting like a stage curtain. He closed his eyes and whispered a single word, Valkyrie. The name hung in the sterile air like an incantation. Valkyrie. The call sign he'd heard through morphine haze in Ramadi, through radio static and helicopter rotor wash, the voice that had kept him alive when everything around him was burning. Valkyrie. The captain who'd carried him through enemy fire, who'd applied a tourniquet with surgical precision while rounds pinged off concrete, who'd stayed with him in the dust and smoke until extraction arrived. He opened his eyes and looked at the medical staff around him. I need to see her. Now. In the conference room, a Marine Corps liaison who'd been touring the hospital's veteran wing stepped into the doorway. His dress blues were pressed to knife-edge perfection, his bearing the kind that came from decades of protocol and tradition. He picked up the medal citation with 2 fingers, careful not to let the weight of it pull him down, and began reading aloud. His voice was clear and authoritative, each word deliberate. For extraordinary heroism under fire in support of Operation Iraqi Freedom. Captain Ashley Cooper, United States Navy Medical Corps, while engaged in direct combat operations in Ramadi, demonstrated exceptional courage and tactical proficiency. Under sustained enemy attack, Captain Cooper identified a critically wounded fellow service member, established a tactical perimeter, and rendered emergency medical intervention while exposed to hostile fire. Her quick decision-making and medical expertise resulted in the preservation of life in circumstances where survival seemed impossible. The words landed like ordnance. Mercer's face was red, not angry red, but the red of a man whose blood pressure had spiked beyond safe limits. He tried to stand. "This is a termination hearing. Not a circus." "I won't be." "At ease, Doctor," the Marine liaison said, and there was no question mark in it. The rank in his voice alone silenced the room. The door opened again. A two-star general in dress blues entered as if he'd been waiting outside for his cue. His presence did something to the air, compressed it somehow, made breathing feel like work. He took one look at the medals on the conference table, one look at the young man holding the folded flag, and executed a salute so crisp it sounded like a whip crack. His fist came to his chest with the force of a heartbeat. Then he held it there, unmoving, waiting for the response that only a superior officer could give. Ashley wasn't in the room yet. She didn't need to be. 30 minutes later, a Pentagon representative arrived with a tablet and the kind of federal authority that made hospital credentials seem like paper thin. His suit was charcoal gray, his tie the color of navy dress blues, and when he set his tablet on the conference table, he moved the medals to the side with the respect they deserved. The screen flickered to life. "Callsign Valkyrie's records have been sealed under national security protocols for the past 5 years," he said, speaking as if the hospital board were hearing this for the first time, which most of them were. That seal was necessary. Captain Cooper's operational history was classified. But seal or no seal, the moment Dr. Mercer demanded an external investigation of this employee, federal law required us to review the circumstances under which those records were sealed. Which meant we had to cross-reference everything in Cedar Creek Medical's federal compliance files. The screen shifted. Invoices. Dozens of them. Hundreds of them. All bearing the Apex Medical Supply logo. All bearing Dr. Marcus Mercer's signature. The numbers climbed $847,000. $1.2 million. $340,000 in a single quarter, all for phantom inventory, all for equipment that had been billed but never delivered, all for a supply chain that existed only in falsified ledgers and the kickback scheme that kept it profitable. "Dr. Mercer," the Pentagon representative said, his voice without inflection, "you initiated this investigation because Captain Cooper was comparing your invoices to actual inventory. She was about to expose this. Instead, you handed us the road map." Mercer's chair clattered backward as he stood. His mouth opened and closed. "This is preposterous. Patient safety was my only concern." "Your only concern was silence," the investigator from the state health department said, stepping forward from the corner where he'd been standing all along, watching, taking notes. "I've spent the last 18 hours following the money trail your inquiry opened. Apex Medical Supply has confirmed the kickback arrangement in exchange for immunity. You received quarterly payments routed through a consulting LLC that exists on paper only. We have bank records. We have emails. We have shipping manifests for equipment that was never delivered to this hospital. We have recorded calls where you and the Apex account manager discussed payment schedules." Mercer's face went from red to white to a color that didn't have a name. "You can't prove 47 fraudulent invoices with your signature," the investigator continued, his tone the flat, impersonal register of someone reading a conviction list. 3 other hospitals where you ran identical schemes before Cedar Creek. The pattern is consistent. The evidence is overwhelming. The only variable is how long you managed to stay employed before the right person looked closely enough. The board chairman arrived within the hour. He was older than Mercer, with the kind of authority that came from decades of committee meetings and capital campaigns, and he didn't need to raise his voice to end the conversation. He stood in the doorway, his silver hair and tailored suit creating an almost supernatural composure, and spoke for words. "Dr. Mercer is suspended, effective immediately. Hospital access revoked. Medical license flagged for emergency review by the state board. By noon, the board had issued a statement. By evening, criminal charges were filed: healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, racketeering. The magnitude of it rendered Mercer's position not just indefensible, but unthinkable. The trial came 3 months later. Mercer's attorney, a woman with the difficult task of defending the indefensible, argued for leniency. "My client has dedicated his life to medicine, to his field. A single mistake in judgment." The judge interrupted. "A single mistake is me counting pills. Your client stole from patients and endangered lives to finance a lifestyle. Medical license revoked permanently. 5 years federal prison, suspended to 18 months with restitution, and you will never practice medicine in this state again." 6 months after that, someone spotted Dr. Marcus Mercer teaching CPR at a community college in East San Antonio for minimum wage. The classroom was a repurposed storage room with industrial carpet and fluorescent panels that hummed with a frequency that made your teeth ache. He stood over a rubber dummy, pressing its chest in rhythmic compressions, demonstrating the protocol he'd once commanded like gospel. His hands shook slightly. No one in the room knew his name. No one knew he'd once run an emergency department. No one cared. The students were there for a certification they needed for their next job, and Mercer was just the guy teaching it, anonymous and diminished, teaching basic life support to people who would never know he'd spent years extracting life from systems that were supposed to protect it. Then came the day that changed the rest. Ashley stood in the rose garden in her dress uniform, navy dress blues, the jacket tailored to her frame, the medals from that wooden box now pinned to her chest in perfect rows. Navy Cross. Silver Star. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Each one catching the Washington sunlight like a small flag. Her son sat in the front row, the folded flag from her fallen teammate resting on his lap, his face bursting with pride in a way that made him look older and younger at the same time. The President of the United States stepped forward. His suit was charcoal gray, his demeanor the kind that came from understanding the weight of ceremony. He took her hand that had held a tourniquet, had performed needle decompression, had guided a young SEAL through darkness back toward light. "Captain Cooper," the President said, his voice clear enough to carry across the garden, "your service was classified for operational security, but your heroism deserves recognition. Your willingness to speak truth, even when it cost you, is the bedrock of what we're supposed to be as a nation." The cameras flashed. History was being recorded. Not the dramatic part. Just the quiet part. A nurse. A captain. A woman who'd saved lives twice, in 2 different wars, in 2 different rooms, with nothing but her training and her will. Afterward, Richardson approached in his own dress uniform, the navy dress blues fitting him now as if they'd been tailored for this moment. He was walking without assistance, the physical therapy had worked, the wound had healed, and more importantly, he'd remembered how to carry himself. He saluted her. Spine straight. Eyes front. The kind of salute that was part greeting, part gratitude, part recognition of rank. She returned it. Captain to petty officer. The hierarchy was irrelevant. They both understood what the gesture meant. "I never got to thank you properly," Richardson said. "Ramadi. And room 12. "Just doing my job," Ashley replied. Both times. There was no humility in it, no false modesty. It was a statement of fact, the way you'd describe a procedure you'd performed correctly. "How's the shoulder?" "Stronger every day," he said. He showed her his forearm again, the Cooper tattoo, black and bold on his skin. "I'm getting Valkyrie added underneath. 2 words in small print, right below the name. If that's okay with you, Captain." She nodded, her eyes wet for the first time anyone could see it. Not tears of sadness. Something else entirely. "Do it." The hospital administrator approached next, flanked by the board chairman, a different board chairman now, the old one having resigned in disgrace. Both men moved carefully, as if afraid of disturbing the moment. The administrator spoke first. "Captain Cooper, we owe you an apology. We'd like to offer you your position back, with a promotion." Director of Emergency Medicine. Full authority to audit and reform our supply systems. Full authority to establish the protocols that should have existed all along. Ashley looked at them for a long moment. That same flat, cold stare from the grand rounds. The one that had unnerved Mercer because it contained no anger, no hurt, just the clear-eyed assessment of someone evaluating a situation for problems. I'll consider it. On one condition, every nurse on staff gets the same respect and authority I'm being offered now. No more fiefdoms. No more silencing the people who see the problems first. We hear them, or we fail. The administrator nodded quickly. Done. Cedar Creek Medical's emergency department was transformed within a year. Supply costs dropped 40%. Patient outcomes improved across every metric. The culture shifted from hierarchy to accountability, from silence to speaking up, from a fiefdom to something that resembled a hospital instead of a kingdom. A quiet culture of respect replaced the old regime. Nurses asked questions. Doctors listened. Supply chains were audited monthly. The system that had almost destroyed Ashley became the model for federal audits nationwide. Other hospitals began investigating their own Dr. Mercers, and the fraud that had been normalized for decades started to crack. Ashley's son visited her at work sometimes, watching his mother move through the emergency department with the same precision she'd used in Ramadi, how assessing, deciding, executing. His mother, the director. His mother, the captain. His mother, the woman who'd sacrificed so much that she'd disappeared entirely, and who'd finally, been allowed to exist. As the days accumulated into months and the months into a new normal, there was a truth that emerged quietly, without fanfare. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Don't mistake silence for weakness. Sometimes it's just discipline. Sometimes it's the restraint of someone who survived things you'll never have to name. Sometimes it's a captain waiting for the right moment to speak, and when she does, the room listens. If you made it this far, you understand what Ashley understood, that heroism isn't what gets medals. Heroism is what happens in the quiet, in the spaces between the cameras, in the moments when no one's watching and you choose integrity anyway. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story of the person you underestimated. Like this video. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been wrong about someone you judged too quickly?